Good evening, and welcome to the U Talk Show. After the runaway success of Psychology Week and the power of positive thinking that suggests that you'll go back and watch it, we're going to do Civics Week. I have gotten in some Facebook arguments recently, which have only been possible because people's education about how the country works really was incomplete. Maybe they skipped school that day, maybe they were smoking dope, or maybe it's just been a hot 40 years since that bit of primary school and we've forgotten what we knew. So I'd sort of like to cover the basics of government, the basics of lawmaking, and the reason that various bodies in the country have the power to make the country run effectively. And to start with that, I'd like to cover the separation of powers, which is one of the most fundamental building blocks of having a government that can respond at both the local scale and the federal scale with only the most hilarious levels of incompetence. Kyle, I believe you said you were going to sling me the questions on this one. So, what would you like to know to start off?
Uh, okay, so there are a few things I already know, but let's face it, civics when me and you were good old little kiddies, it wasn't very good, and I don't think it's particularly great today. So let's just start with the basics, and we'll go over everything regardless of whether or not I know it. Tell us about the three levels of government and then the three branches of government.
Okay, so the three levels of government, that's really simple. Everyone here, you all know them already. There's your federal
You
government,
would be surprised how many
which,
people I have met that don't actually know how many levels of government we have.
no, I wouldn't be. The federal government, you recently voted Albo for PM. That's your federal government right there. At the scale of Australia, the entire country, multiple states and territories working together, the federal government is empowered by the Constitution to make laws for the good governance of and for the effective running of a country. Um, then you have the state government, who do such things as maintain some of your roads, um, determine the exact way in which they disapprove of murder. I'm serious. The Crimes Act is different in every state. Murder is illegal everywhere. You cannot go to another state and go, I want to experience murdering
That's
someone. That's not
interesting.
going to work.
Different standards for punishing murder in each state. That's
Yeah, and
very interesting.
sometimes different exact definitions of what the crime involves.
Hmm.
Um, and then we have local government who you usually bitch about on your Facebook community group because you say, oh, these councillors know nothing. They raise our rates and they're not in touch with the community. Who do they think they are? Seriously, why does every community have a Facebook group and the predominant content of that group is people whinging about council? That's Local governments are empowered in
Tough to
every
answer.
state and territory by the Local Government Act. Very imaginatively named. Uh,
Mm.
and basically, the
Because
only
sorry to
difference between
interrupt you,
those
but
acts
local
is the
government.
year in which they were enacted.
Yeah. So sorry to interrupt you, but local government. There's a sort of misconception here. To clear up, local government is defined by the states individually, right? Like
Yes, that's
each
correct.
state has their own local government act, and each state essentially determines the rights, responsibilities, and powers of local government.
With one
And
exception. The Australian Capital Territory does not
uh,
have local government. The Australian Capital Territory delegated the running of local government to the territory government.
hmm.
So that's okay because the
I
ACT
mean,
is
it's
where
small enough to
politicians
do
go
that.
die
Like,
anyway.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's small enough of an area that and it's only got what, just Canberra as the city. Has it got any other towns in it?
Yeah, only the ones it kind of shares with New South Wales.
Okay, interesting.
Because I know we were talking earlier about the Indigenous voice to Parliament, and
Mm.
as of the time of recording this, that should be dropping in about 15 minutes. Um, by the time you
30
see this,
actually.
it'll have been a few days ago.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the differences in requirements between someone in the Central Northern Territory and someone on the coast in New South Wales, and how those people may have conflicting requirements. And I suppose that's sort of the problem of scale you have in the ACT too. It's tiny, absolutely small. There just isn't much going on there. So it's easier to treat it as a homogenous region. The other thing you asked about was the split of responsibilities.
Yes, rights, responsibilities, and in fact, I could take this one because at least partly, because a lot of people blame local governments, but local government effectively is very much controlled by the states to such a degree that, I mean, when the states don't like, you know, something that a choice that that local government is making, they can alter the way local
Override
government
it.
works to override
Yeah,
it.
this was the
Such as
amalgamation nonsense
that's
that
what I was
allowed a
about to
bunch
bring
of
up.
development projects to be pushed through.
Yeah, WestConnex, if I remember correctly, was the reason for it. Essentially how many billions of dollars handout to Liberal Party donors, but that's another story, and we won't get into that today because this isn't Corruption Week, this is Civics Week. But essentially, when
Everyone's
the
favorite C
government at the
word.
time, everyone but mine, maybe. Um, interpret that how you will.
I
So,
think it's your favorite too. Fighting corruption gives you a purpose.
oh, that's yeah. Well, that sounds like a great answer. I'll take it.
If God did not exist, we would have to create him. I think that was Voltaire who said that.
Wow, that's okay. You know what? As interesting as that is, we probably
Yeah.
shouldn't get too bogged down in it because that's a very lovely philosophical thought. But we've got things to get to. But yeah, so during the council amalgamations, essentially it was certain councils didn't like WestConnex because it wasn't really a great plan. It was a giant waste of money.
Mhm.
And so the state government of New South Wales just amalgamated the councils. They threw different councils together into larger councils, in
Slapped them
such a
together with hot
way
glue and
as
had the
to
numbers to pass the development.
yeah, and it was purely just to get the numbers to pass the development in each of those councils. There was no other rhyme or reason. They didn't take into account local needs. Hence why I think we need local government enshrined in the Constitution. But that's a
But
whole other story.
we've
Mhm.
already had that tried.
I don't
That was
have
attempted in
have we
1988. That was
interesting
attempted in
interesting
1988 for local government to be defined in the federal constitution as a necessary part of government. And it
interesting.
was something like a 60-40 split against.
Oh wow, that's Was it one of
Perhaps,
those
though,
things of
with more
people
recent
didn't like the
state government
cons?
corruption showing the good idea of it.
Yeah, I'm wondering, did they? I don't know if you know why people voted how they did, but if you know anything, was it one of those the devil's in the detail kind of things, or was it more the overall concept didn't appeal?
It was, as I understand, held to be the local government acts already existed. The people of Australia
Mm.
broadly held that changing the constitution in that way was not necessary.
Okay, so it was one of
Um,
those like this isn't a problem kind of
but it
things,
wasn't the
you know?
split of responsibilities at government levels that you had asked about that I was trying to come to. It was the
Yes,
split
yes,
of it was the split of powers.
yeah. Well, I said
Um,
rights, responsibilities, and powers.
yeah. So federal government is more like an accountancy, realistically. Federal parliament ratifies and makes laws and trade agreements. Um, they control things like providing money to the state healthcare systems. They are responsible for all our obligations under international treaties. For instance, I live in the Blue Mountains. I'm basically surrounded by national park. It's not a state park, it's a national park. It's also a UNESCO World Heritage Area, which means that every level of government, federal, state, and council, are responsible for the preservation of this area and have an interest in that. Um,
Interesting.
Federal Parliament's also responsible for taxation because that's where they get the money to provide to the states for the running of the country. So,
If it wouldn't take too much time, I'm curious as to how that responsibility is shared, how that's managed.
okay, so we have two sets of powers that are defined in the Australian Constitution and that are referred to whenever we talk about laws. Those are exclusive powers, powers that only one government branch has, or one government level, and concurrent powers, which are shared. A good example of a concurrent power, though not strictly related, would be when the New South Wales police cooperate with the Australian Federal Police in an investigation. Technically, one or the other may have the right to say, no, hands off, we're taking this. But in reality, it's more efficient to bring to bear the expertise of both bodies.
Okay.
In the same way, we have concurrent powers, for instance, in healthcare. Federal Parliament or the federal government is responsible for funding all public healthcare, but it is the states and territories that operate their healthcare bodies and are responsible for using that funding to provide a service.
So, on a practical level, my understanding is that what that essentially means is federal government figures out how it's going to be funded, and the state government figures out the logistics of delivering those services.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and would that be the same for the forestry thing you talked about earlier for the national park? Similar?
Okay, so theoretically, federal government is responsible for making sure that we do not, pardon me, violate our obligations under any of the agreements we have internationally, and that includes protection of World Heritage Areas. But the federal government will set guidelines and requirements, and the state government has a lot of latitude as long as they can comply with those to determine how best to protect the natural environment, how to balance the need for development versus the need for conservation, etc.
Okay, so it seems like in that regard, when it comes to like international treaties, and fulfilling the obligation for that, the federal government more sets the boundaries or the parameters and then provides oversight, while the state government
Yes.
takes on the logistics of actually carrying out the service or task at hand.
Yes, just so. And local government is actually responsible for development approvals, and they too have to work within the confines set by the state. However, the concurrency of state powers and local government powers is a lot less well defined. And so you do have situations where a local government will fight against something or for something only for state to go, nah, no, that's not the way we're doing it.
Much like with council amalgamations in New South Wales.
Yes.
Mm.
That
So we've
is
only
a
got a
very
few
good
minutes
example.
left. Yeah, we've only got a few minutes left. So I guess we've covered the sort of separation of powers between the states. What about the separation of powers within the? I'm
Within
forgetting the
each of
word, but
those levels of government, yes.
yeah, within each of the levels. There's a word for it. I'm forgetting, but the legislative, executive, judiciary, that sort of stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so I
Would
love
it be
this.
would it be very I guess accurate to just describe it as one makes laws, one figures out where actions lie within regard to the law, and the other, I guess, executes the tasks as defined by the laws.
No, it does not. So
Was it that bad of a description there?
no, it's just that Australia doesn't have a clean separation of powers.
Right, sure, yeah.
It theoretically exists, but Australia does not have complete separation
Mm. It's a
because
bit more like a Venn diagram, eh?
some of the responsibilities of those branches overlap. But also
I'm
the
curious,
executive
actually.
power.
I'm curious. What do you think of that? Do you think it should be cleaner, or do you think it's like a cleaner separation, or do you like that it's a Venn
I
diagram? Part
honestly
of me,
think what we have works. It provides the
hmm,
flexibility for cooperation while still allowing for government bodies to divest themselves of conflicts of interest.
hmm.
If only they would sometimes, but I digress. But also,
hence
so
the C word we all like to use.
here's the
Um,
problem: the executive branch of government in Australia is a little bit weird. The
because it's part of the
executive,
parliament essentially.
no, it isn't. The executive of Australia is His Majesty King Charles.
Well,
His power
technically,
is represented. His power is represented in Australia by the Governor General as the representative of His Majesty, and at the state level is represented by the state governors as representatives of His Majesty, which is why part of the lawmaking process is royal assent, kicking it up to the Governor or Governor General to sign off and say, yeah, this isn't going to piss His Majesty off, go nuts.
technically yes. Although in practice, it's fairly different. The
I would
actual.
argue that
I
in
mean, look,
practice we don't have an executive branch of government.
I think I disagree because I'd say because the executive branch of government essentially is whichever party is in government because they do take executive actions. Um, Only they're also part of the parliament, making them part of the legislative branch. I actually think this
Yes, and
works really well to a degree, except for the
technically
part where the
speaking,
government is a party.
yeah, technically speaking, the executive is comprised of His Majesty the King, represented by the Governor General and the state governors and territory governors, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet.
Hmm.
So, yeah,
But the prime
that is
minister and the
that.
cabinet are basically, in parliament. Again, partially merging those two.
Yes.
Hmm.
As for uh, the legislative branch of government, it is just referred to in Australia as the Parliament.
Hmm.
I will remind everyone that we have what is referred to as a bicameral parliament in Australia, which means that it is comprised of two camels instead of only one.
You've
What this
used that
actually
joke
means
before.
is what this actually means is that Parliament is split into two bodies: the lower house and the upper house, the Senate and the House of Reps.
Hmm.
Um, Realistically, that is a stylistic decision. There is no reason why having a bicameral parliament is inherently superior to a unicameral parliament. It's just the
Hmm.
way we've done things for a while, and it seems to be working.
Well, I mean, there were reasons why it was set up. Namely that some states thought that due to their lower population, they might get a raw deal out of the federal government. This was going back to federation, right when we were starting out. Some states thought that they'd essentially be left behind, and that the focus would be on states like New South Wales and Victoria, which had a much higher population. And so
It's
while
also
one was
fair to
based
point
off
out that
geographic, if I could finish,
mhm,
if one while one was based on geographic areas of population, um, the other was based on the states which and territories, which the states had an equal number of representatives, and also the territories had an equal number of representatives and that's the Senate. Although I still don't understand why they have 6-year terms. To me, that just seems
okay, so
unnecessary, and also like it's slowing down the kind of change that we might need at times. What do you think?
there's a lot to be said for having a blend of stability and fresh ideas. When you pull, as we've recently seen with Twitter, for instance, when you rip away all the people who actually know how a system works, the system very quickly starts not working in some very weird ways.
Hmm. Although we
It
have
is the
we have
same for
discussed
any
this
human
earlier.
governmental institution.
Yeah, we have actually discussed this numerous times.
Mm.
Just us. Um, And I believe that the conclusion that we ended up coming to was that that kind of expertise could be in permanent staff that are there to help
Yeah, an
any
expanded civil
incoming,
service.
yeah, an expanded civil
Uh,
service to help new parliamentarians get into the swing of things and really understand how the whole thing works.
but the
And
thing I really wanted to get to, because we have deviated here and we are running past time,
yes, we
um,
have just run past time. We've got about a minute before we're way over time.
is that at Federation, there was one other consideration with regards to population density, and that is that um, just pulling up the exact title here. The Act for the Better Government of Her Majesty's Australian Colonies, August 1850, covered what are now 4 of the states. By 1860, every state and territory save one was self-governing.
Mm,
Western Australia did not become self-governing until 1890.
mm,
That is a 30-year lag. And Western Australia would have borne the brunt not only of a reduced population, but also just being the youngest kid on the block at Federation. And it's important to note that it's just not population, but also a sense of uncertainty about a colony's place in a growing nation that might lead to this.
mm.
But going back to our 3 roles, our separation of powers, we have Parliament. Parliament makes and amends laws. Um, there's a whole process about that. We will be going into it. The executive branch, so the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the Crown, are responsible for putting those laws into action, effectively the implementation. And the judiciary is where the laws are tested when there is ambiguity. And sometimes that ambiguity is, I ran over 3 people in my car, and apparently they're telling me that wasn't entirely legal, Your Honor. And sometimes it is more of a test of whether a law is in compliance with the Australian Constitution, for instance.
Mm.
The judiciary was partially responsible for I think it was about 10 or 12 years ago now, a number of members of parliament were found to have dual
Right.
citizenships.
Yeah,
And
and
that is one of
therefore
those things where the
technically
judiciary
ineligible.
gets involved because it wasn't a situation of pressing charges. It wasn't a situation of any serious punitive action being taken, but it still was necessary to consult the judiciary, the federal court, to determine the actual scope of the legal problem that they faced. As it turned out, the problem was significant in any respect, but the courts like to feel important too.
Yeah.
So I think that
Um,
covers the separation of powers for
that's
the
good because we have
most part.
yeah, we have run over time, so we'll end it there then. But this was interesting. I actually learned a few things myself here. Um, but thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.
And I hope that all of you playing along at home actually pass your HSC legal studies this year. I believe in you.
Take
Good
care.
night, y'all.